Sheriff Maggie O'Neill of a small fishing town in Maine didn't like late-night calls, especially the ones that came from the abandoned fishing trawler Sea Maiden, which had sunk in the bay 5 years ago. There was only a whisper on the line, barely audible through the static, but Maggie clearly heard her name. Maggie, come to us. For weeks now she had been sleeping in short bursts, struggling to push away obsessive thoughts about the unexplained radio interference that was knocking out equipment all over town. Maggie, a tired woman in her mid-40s, with a weather-beaten face and eyes that had seen too much human sorrow, had always relied on facts and common sense. She had survived the death of her husband, who had been the captain of the Sea Maiden, and had learned not to trust gut feelings. But in recent days her world, usually so predictable and bound by law, had begun to crack. The radio in her patrol car started turning on by itself, always tuning to the same dead frequency, and the dashboard compass spun wildly. These strange events were already starting to scare her deputy, a young kid fresh out of the academy. That night, after yet another call from the long-dead ship, Maggie decided to check out the old abandoned Coast Guard tower, the supposed source of the signal. As she drove up to it, the air began to hum, and her car's headlights went out. From the darkness came a familiar whisper, louder now, fuller, and it seemed to come from the ocean itself. "We're waiting, Maggie. Come and find us." She stood alone, in total darkness, and for the first time in years, a chill that had nothing to do with the sea breeze ran down her spine. Something beyond reason had come to her small town. Maggie returned to the station, trying to convince herself it was just exhaustion and a dramatic echo from old equipment. She forced herself to go through the case files on the Sea Maiden, a standard storm wreck, no evidence, no bodies, recovered except for one that washed up days later. The captain, her husband, was never found. Maggie buried herself in the work, trying to find some rational thread in all this. She called in federal interference specialists, but they just shrugged, unable to explain the phenomenon. They recorded abnormal electromagnetic pulses coming from the bay, but couldn't identify the source. The whisper from the phone became more insistent. Now it invaded her dreams. Maggie saw herself underwater, surrounded by silent figures reaching out to her, then dissolving into the darkness. She felt a cold that didn't just chill her to the bone, it stole her awareness. One night, waking up drenched in sweat, Maggie discovered that all the electronic clocks in her house had stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m., the exact time the Sea Maiden had last made. In desperation, she went to the local library, an old dusty building guarding the town's century-old secrets. As she combed through old newspapers and fishermen's journals, Maggie stumbled upon a yellowed 1903 article about a similar incident. An entire fishing fleet disappeared after voices from the sea allegedly lured the ships into the abyss. Locals back then spoke of singing stones that appeared on the shore after storms and drove people mad. And then she found something truly disturbing. In her husband's personal logbook, kept aboard the Sea Maiden, there was a final entry, not in his handwriting. "They are singing, and their song is beautiful. We are going to them. We'll be back soon, Maggie, all of us." Maggie felt the ground slip from under her. Her husband couldn't have written that. But if not him, then who? Or what? The anomaly was no longer just pressing at the edges of her mind. It was reaching into her very heart, promising to return what she'd lost or to take what remained. Maggie realized she had to go back to where it all began, the site of the Sea Maiden's wreck, She took an old sonar device that once belonged to her husband and set out into the bay on a small boat. The GPS quickly lost its bearings, but Maggie steered by instinct toward the place where the air over the water seemed thicker and the silence too deep. Suddenly, the sonar display flickered to life, drawing something vast and indescribable on the seabed. Not the wreck of a ship, but a pulsing mass from which the electromagnetic pulses emanated. The whisper had become a song, and Maggie recognized her husband's voice calling her name. She lowered a microphone connected to speakers into the water. From the depths came voices, hundreds, thousands blending into an unearthly symphony. It was both beautiful and terrifying. They sang of unity, of merging, of how good it felt to be part of something greater than yourself. Maggie heard her husband in that choir, the other fishermen from the Sea Maiden, and then voices she had never heard before but somehow recognized. It was a call, slowly and inexorably pulling her into the abyss. Summoning all her will, Maggie did what her husband should have done, but apparently couldn't. She pulled out an emergency signal buoy always stored on the boat and threw it into the heart of the anomaly. The buoy was designed to summon the Coast Guard, its signal powerful and focused. It was a desperate act, meant to drown out the call. For a moment the singing swelled, unbearable and physically painful, and then abruptly stopped. The sonar display went dark, and the compass on the boat pointed north again. Maggie was alone, surrounded by silence broken only by the lapping of waves. The threat seemed to have passed. Maggie returned home by dawn, drained but alive. She took a hot shower, trying to wash away the residue of that otherworldly chill. Then she poured herself a strong coffee and sat on the porch, watching the first rays of sunlight touch the bay. The radio interference was gone, and the town breathed normally again. She even allowed herself a smile, thinking that maybe, finally, she could get some sleep. But as she raised the cup to her lips, her gaze fell on her wedding ring, which she had never taken off. On the inner side, where their initials and wedding date had always been engraved, there was now another tiny, barely visible rune. A symbol that had never been there before, but somehow felt familiar.